Thanks everyone for coming to tonight. First, let me introduce myself. I'm He Zhiguo, the Fuji Independent Fellow Professor of Finance at the Chicago booth and the director of Becker Friedman Institute, China, BFI-China. I'm truly delighted today to welcome each one of you to the new event that we branded as Decoding China together with Damien. We think this is a very nice way of saying what we want to do. And it's also that, given the recent event, it's just crazy world out there. And just such a lovely night that we can talk about the things in a very peaceful way. And I really appreciate everybody coming to participation. I also would like to share that this is a collaborative journey with the Paulson Institute, where Damien is headed. He's a managing director and co-founder of Marco Polo, think tank of the Paulson Institute. Together, we will initiate this PI, Paulson Institute and BFI partnership, and aiming to bring relevant and thought-provoking discussions along the way. And hopefully, we will gather both live and in person in both in the quarterly frequency, and we will try to figure out what will be the most interesting topics. And sometimes we will also reach out to you for the guidance of the topics. Obviously, the audience will be not just the University of Chicago, as today put into the downtown area. We would like to really get a reach to the greater Chicago professional community. And thanks, everybody. Please stay tuned and follow us for the regular updates. And now come to the main guest panel. Would like to talk about the Decoding China, the Chinese economic miracle interrupted. That's a question mark there. Would like to introduce our moderator for tonight. Is Kaiser Kuo. His name is Chinese name that I just learned, which is really such a delightful to learn that today I can talk to someone. When I was a kid, I was just God there. His Chinese name is Guo Yiguang, and actually is Tang Chao's founding. Tang Chao is a super famous rock star band when I was a kid. Think about someone who was like 13, 14, first listening to this kind of rock music. And today I actually saw him. Wow. So he right now.
Boy, was he disappointed.
He's the head of podcast at the China Project. He has been the voice behind this the Sinica podcast for over 13 years, guiding thousands of listeners through the complexities and intricacies of China evolution. He has a wide array of experience before moving with his family to the United States in 2016. He lived in Beijing for 20 years, and I stopped counting. Yeah, exactly that time. that I listened to their music. It's really astonishing. Okay, his journey from Beijing to the United States with stories spanning 2 decades brings a wealth of insights that I believe we will enrich our discussion tonight. And without further ado, let's just move on to Kaiser.
Welcome to this special live recording of the Sinica podcast here in Chicago, Illinois. Hello, Chicago! I am Kaiser Kuo, and we are here tonight with this terrific and very handsome and well-appointed crowd from Chicago, by an event put on by the University of Chicago's Becker Friedman Institute for Economics, a program that pulls together folks from Chicago's Booth School of Business with its Kenneth G. Griffin Department of Economics, its Harris School of Public Policy, and its law school. Becker Friedman has partnered with the Paulson Institute and its in-house think tank Macro Polo still the cleverest name ever given to an organization dedicated to research on China, Macro Polo, but that's some kid from the world. And with the China Project, of which this podcast is a proud part, and we are all joining together to bring you tonight's program, Decoding China, China's Economic Miracle Interrupted. A huge thank you to our friends at the Becker Friedman Institute and at the Paulson Institute for making this happen in this magical spot. The sun's coming down, and you look at the beauty of the amazing Chicago skyline. What of you? If I'm, sort of not listening and wandering off distracted, you'll know exactly why. Okay. So there's so much to talk about. So let's jump in. All summer long, we've heard deep pessimism about the state of the Chinese economy. There is a long litany of woes that have been repeated and amplified to the extent that I've gotten, frankly, kind of suspicious. Flagging consumer demand, we all know a stubbornly high savings rate accompanying that, the obvious problems faced now by major residential realty developers like Evergrande and Country Garden, high levels of youth unemployment, and of course enormous local government debt. Now, none of my guests today are the sort of economists that American presidents and CEOs have often wished they had at hand. That is, economists with only one hand, and they don't always say on the one hand and on the other hand. As for me, I don't mind hearing or engaging a little on the one hand myself. So on the one hand, ordinarily, when I do hear this level of sort of kind of hyper pessimism, this sheer volume of doomsaying, much of it built on, I think, frankly, motivated reasoning, my instinct is to be very skeptical. China, after all, has defeated, has defied predictions of doom many a time, including in the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and in the Great Recession after 2008, the crisis of 2015 when the Chinese stock market plummeted. It seems like it's always able to muddle through. But on the other hand, as a growing number of people whose views I very much trust have come back from trips to China recently, it's clear to me that the pessimism isn't by any means limited just to these distant economists or reporters writing about China from the outside. So when we hear about the PTSD, the shell shock caused in places like Shanghai by the lockdowns and by the chaotic, confusing end to COVID restrictions, coupled with this kind of flagging exports, weak signals from the manufacturing sector, unemployment, and of course confusion in policy direction overall. I do worry. I take the bears a little more seriously, and yet back to that other hand, as an economist who I greatly respect, especially he said, this is Arthur Kroger from Gap Culture Economics. He gave a very good talk at Harvard recently. He said that this bad news has been enlisted by some in claiming that their grand narratives going back decades were correct all along. A relatively small amount of data, he notes, is being made to do an awful lot of work. That's true. So today is really all about right-sizing the problem, where the negativity might perhaps be warranted and where it certainly is not, as well as identifying problems that perhaps aren't being given sufficient attention in the reportage that we're all reading. We'll talk about the nature of the crisis and the nature of the state response, such as it is. So joining me to attack this important question with both hands, as it were, and to try to get this right is Chang-Tai Hsieh, Hsieh Chang-Tai, who is the Phyllis and Irwin Winklereid Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the Booth School and specializes in development and growth in the development world. He is an elected member of the Academia Sinica, I like that name, and a two-time recipient of the Sunye Feng Prize. Chang-Tai, welcome to Sinica. Thank you.
Great to be here.
Also joining is Lizzi C, who's well known to folks who listen to Sinica or who follow the China Project. She is the host of our YouTube show, The Signal with Lizzi C, where she does interviews with amazing people, and she's just a really expert interviewer. Lizzi also hosts the Chinese language show Wall Street TV, Wall Street Today rather, which is something I highly recommend. It's about the only non-lunatic Chinese language programming on it. Everything else is either like hardcore party line or Falun Gong or what's that kid's name? go away, right? And then there's Lizzi, who's like an island of sanity on YouTube in the Chinese language. Anyway, last time that we were together with Damien here was here in Chicago. Our friends at the Chicago Council summoned us to do a sort of roundup of the 20th Party Congress, where some very, very interesting remarks were made. That takes us, of course, to Damien Ma, who is director of Macro Polo, the think tank of the Paulson Institute. Damien is the co-author of a great book, which I'm still constantly recommending to people. It's really stood the test of time. It's called In Line, Behind a Billion People, and it really looks at a lot of issues related to China's economy and politics through the lens of scarcity. It's a very, very good book. I highly recommend it. Damien is always one of the people I turn to for the straight dope on what's happening in the Chinese economy. Damien, great to see you, man.
Very good to see you.
Lizzi, Chang-Tai, what a great time. So, Damien, let me start with you. You were just in China. You got back just a little over a week ago. And you had both high-level meetings and some sort of boots on the ground, some shoe leather work, just talking to people who are either decision makers, economic decision makers at the enterprise level or above, and people who are just directly affected by the economy in China, people who've experienced the chaotic end of COVID. What's the scheme? What's your overall takeaway from talking to people? Are things as bad as they say?
Well, let me give sort of two quick but different observations. I think Kaiser, like you or Lizzi, when we go to China, we tend to not to stay in the hotel. I got there a few days early so I could, first walk around, kind of do my own observations. Small things like, are the malls full, right? Are people buying things? How normal does Beijing look? And caveat that, I mostly interacted with a very small slice of Beijing elites. So they're not what I would call the true BFI-China, right? They are still Beijing elites, so take that with a grain of salt. But, and I talked to Chinese colleagues and talked to, the dwindling number of foreign correspondents who are still fighting a good fight in Beijing, just to kind of get a pulse from the people, and had my share of cabbie conversations.
Oh, cabbie conversations.
And the reason I wanted to have the cabbie conversations, this is probably an interesting tangential observation, is that something like 90% of Beijing cabs are now electric vehicles made by a state-owned enterprise. This really happened over the last several years. So if you want to see the transformation in electric vehicles, look no further than Beijing City itself. And this is purely a state-mandated drive. They basically wanted to help the state-owned enterprise. So if you went to China prior to the pandemic, you would have probably ridden in a South Korean Hyundai cab. Those basically do not exist anymore. So they're all electric vehicles now. So if you want to kind of get a little small slice of that change, Beijing does give you that little insight. But in terms of the economy, I'll just say a couple of things, and I think they're the things we're going to get into quite a bit with the other guests as well. I think talking to people, talking to friends and colleagues, there does seem to be a sense of just things are not going that well. People are not seeing the bright light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the economy. So I think in this sense, the Chinese government is probably correct in diagnosing that there is a lack of confidence among households about where the economy is going, and I think that does the malls were full, but I think it is also somewhat true that people are not you did not see a lot of sort of purchasing behavior, which I thought was kind of interesting. There was a lot of more window shopping, so to speak, than people actually pulling out their credit cards. Although I guess not credit card, paying with Apple Pay or WeChat, because that's all you can do these days in Beijing. I think that struggle is real, and I think at the policy level, what's interesting is I think they understand that this is a problem, but there is, from what I can tell, a very strong debate about really what to do about it.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of arguments, and we're going to get into the different arguments, but I think it's tough to turn around consumer and household confidence. It takes a lot. It takes a combination of policy, a combination of incentives, and also Also sending very credible, consistent signals for a period of time to get people to understand where the economy is going. And I think part of the problem that the current leadership has is that it's sending very mixed signals about what's happening to the economy and what they intend to do about it. And I think that's not, that's really giving people, that's injecting more confusion through average Chinese households. So I think it's a very tough conundrum, and if they don't turn that around, it's very, very hard to sustain the growth rate that they want, which is why they may want to stimulate, but stimulus will get you a very sort of short-term bump. They may get you, that might allow them to meet their 5% target for the year, but what happens in 2024? So this is something that they're truly grappling with, and I really got that sense from talking to average Chinese baby boomers.
Yeah. So excellent. There are two. I mean, not surprisingly, there are two global financial crises that this is often compared to, or not global, but two other historical financial crises that the current situation is often compared to. One of them, of course, is the 2008 financial crisis that started in the U.S. retail housing market, but also the malaise that beset Japan beginning right around 1990. That one is brought up an awful lot. Lizzi, I know you have some thoughts on this. I'm wondering whether you think that China is also about to enter a long period of stagnation and painfully slow growth. Are there meaningful ways in which China right now is comparable to Japan then?
Right. So, in general, I'm always against making those quick and dirty historical analogies because I think they usually are more misleading than educational. In terms of Japan, my argument is that Japan's problem is not really an asset market problem. It's a structural problem in the sense that the Japanese economy has this interlinked financial sector and corporate sector co-collateralized by its net value. So a piece of asset prices goes down, the entire system goes down with it. It reminds me of Charleston, those historical buildings in Charleston. So if you have a spark of fire, the entire city will burn down. The problem is not the fire, the problem is how the city is structured. In China, the system is much more fragmented, actually intentionally so. So there's not much financial linkage between China's corporate sector and its financial sector. China's problems are those, much more fragmented pockets of problem, cysts and tumors in local governments, in rural banks. But those problems tend to be separate from each other. So the potential of a horizontal, all-out contagion, I would say, is low. So, people talk about whether China is going to lose in 20 years and in 30 years, like Japan. The fundamental problem is quite different. The similarity is on the surface. So that's Japan. For the 2008 analogy, I would actually argue the property market now in China now is less like pre-2008 United States than a few years ago, than say 2015. And that's a deliberate policy choice. China has been aggressively reducing its corporate sector's exposure to property market rules for the past few years. I mean, yes, property market loans are still a substantial part of commercial banks' assets, but those are individual house mortgages, quite unlike the United States. And we know Chinese households pay hefty down payments, and those loans are recourse loans. So banks can claim alternate assets if they default. So that's a relatively safe, a safe net for banks. So commercial banks, if you look at their balance sheet, they're actually quite solid. That's very different from pre-2008 in the United States. So I'll just make those two up.
Yeah, let me turn to Chang-Tai and ask you about the 2008 comparisons that are also that are so often made. Let's start by looking at the amount of leverage in the system. I mean, that's one thing we all probably are aware of, the very, very high percentage of the cost of the home that you have to put down, whether you're a first timer or a multi-time home buyer in China, and the amount actually of equity that people have in their homes right now. But the other thing that seems to be missing is, we don't have mortgage-backed securities in China where that we had here. We don't have collateralized, what would they call it? I can't remember the names of those, the bizarre things that we all suffered from back then, but would help, collateralize debt obligations and credit default swaps that were betting against the CDOs, right? Is China less vulnerable in that regard?
Let me just say three things. I think that first, let me just repeat what Lizzie said. I think that it is always dangerous, but it's very easy to draw analogies, right? To draw analogies, but most of the time, the world is complicated, and they can be very misleading. I mean, they can be very misleading. So let me just say, I think that if I think about sort of two views that I see, which is that China needs a stimulus, and that China has a confidence problem. I think that is a misleading way to think about what's going on now. I think really the way I think about what China is going through now is that it's a combination of two things. So first, specifically on Kaiser's question, I think about the first issue, and I like to think about that as a reallocation problem, as a reality that I think that there's no question that there has been overexpansion in the housing sector in China. That what does that mean? It means that because of the housing price bubble and because of other factors, too much resources have been dedicated to the real estate sector, say in the last 15 or so years, right? What do you do about that, right? Well, exactly the wrong thing to be doing is to double up, right? That's exactly what you don't want to do, because that's going to make the reallocation problem down the line even worse, right?
What would constitute doubling down on this right now? You mean
Supporting, either some form of stimulus that supports the real estate sector. So let me just say some of the, and part of the problem is that, there's always going to be short-run pain whenever there is an adjustment process. Let me just say some of that has already taken place. Like when I saw, like the beginning of this process was really starting in 2018, when you start to see the crackdown on some of the largest Chinese conglomerates. The crackdown on Arban, the crackdown on the
gray rhinos.
Right, the gray rhinos. Actually, since we're here, for those of you who can look across the street, if you see those three towers right across the street, that was initially a Wanda project.
Dalian Wanda. Yeah.
Right, the three towers that you see just across the road, 200 yards from where we are, and then one of the consequences of the crackdown on the Wanda Group starting in 2018 was that they were forced to sell off those three towers. So it's now called Vista Towers, right? Vista Towers, and the new owners got it on the cheap because the Wanda Group was forced to sell that, not just that property, but lots of the other stuff. Now there's still a lot left to be done. Whether, I'm not privy to the internal discussions of the party on how they're planning to deal with this, but let me just give you, what I think is a right historical analogy to think about this issue, which is that it's really not 2008, but it's 1998. So if you think about what happened in 1998, China put in place this program that I don't know whether this was the official name of the program, but this is what people started to call it, which is grasp the large, let go the small. So it was essentially a program put in place by Premier Zhu Rongji to deal with another big reallocation problem. And what was the big reallocation problem then was
bloated state-owned enterprise.
It was bloated state-owned enterprise. It was that you had a very large number, I mean, there's some disputes about what the precise number is, that a very large share of capital, a very large share of the resources of the economy was going to inefficient state-owned firms. And I think it's the same question, which is, what do you do with that? There is going to be short-run pain. Companies need to be closed. People are going to lose their jobs, are going to lose their job. You can postpone the pain by continuing to subsidize these companies, by just, renewing the loans and just kicking the can down the road. And that's not what China chose to do in 1998. It put this plan in place, which led to a lot of short-run pain. It led to a tremendous amount of short-run pain, but it was the largest closure and privatization programs that I've ever seen in the world. A large number of firms were closed down. A large number of firms were privatized. There are interesting details about what privatization meant. We can talk about that next. But lots of people lost their job, and this sort of was the beginning of the process where it released the resources eventually for the millions of entrepreneurial private firms to eventually emerge and grow grow in China. There are lots of details about what happened. There were these institutions that were built on the financial side. We can talk about the asset management companies that were built in place. So there are all kinds of that. It's not just that program, but it was coupled with lots of other things that were put in place at the same time. Now, I want to say, I don't know whether something like this is in the cards, right? Is in the cards? I don't, but that really is a short-run issue. I mean, and the question is whether this short-run issue eventually it could become a long-run issue if it's not resolved.
Right, and especially since the scale of it is very different. I mean, we're talking about breaking and resetting a bone, right? We're talking about, it's not just pulling off a Band-Aid. We're talking about something, a major structural readjustment. And let's look what happened in '99 when, China was a much smaller portion of the global economy. And already it was incredibly painful domestically. I think you could draw a direct line to the Falun Gong, rise of Falun Gong in the sit-ins, potentially these politically destabilizing events in that time, right? So today, much bigger, much more integrated, much more risk of global contagion.
In terms of the risk, in terms of the effect of the world, I think it's absolutely right. But in terms of the scale of the problem in China, I think it's much smaller.
Okay, that's really
in terms of the scale. Now, whether there is, I'm going to say, the equivalent of Zhurongji and the people that were around him at the time. One of the key people at the time was Wang Qishan. At the time that was there. Whether there's that team, whether I don't know, right? I don't know. But I'll just say that when I look at other countries of the world, the vast majority of the countries around the world that face this kind of problem, they never solve it, right? Because it's painful, and if things that are painful, you just don't do it, right? I don't know.
So I want to drill down on this a little bit with Lizzi. We know that there's nothing that shakes confidence in the economy more than uncertainty. And I think what I hear a lot of complaints about are sort of the lack of clear signals and intention to backstop coming from the leadership. I mean, in 1998, to Chang-Tai's point, we had Zhurongji, fairly firm hand on the tiller. We had, Wang Qishan. Today, we're just coming out of the transition. We have a relatively new premier, Li Qiang, and He Feng just now appointed. Do we have the same sort of caliber of administrative management of the economy?
Right. So that's a really good question. I mean, I've been pondering this term, crisis of confidence. People talk about it in the media a lot. Like, what do we actually mean by crisis of confidence, right? So, like Damien, I also had the opportunity to interact with a cross-section of Chinese citizens. Some of them are entrepreneurs, some of them are low government officials, some of them are recent college grads. And I do get the sense that there's this general sense of anxiety and unease, which I have not seen before. I mean, we Chinese are a grumpy bunch. We complain about parents, complain about kids, complain about neighbors, etc., etc. But this time, I feel like the brush is very much pointed toward current policymakers, even to the top leadership. And the general sense is that there's something amiss there, and they're not quite sure the direction this country is heading is what they imagine to be. So there's that real sense of anxiety here.
How much of a product of the COVID closure and lockdowns?
So yeah, so we can definitely talk about that. But like my point is like that is actually not consistent with the raw economic data you see. If you look at the data, I mean, first half of the year, consumption actually went up by more than 8%. Wage and disposable income went up more than 6%. It's not breakneck pace by any stretch of imagination, but it's not that bad. I mean, it's not great by Chinese standard, but it's not a picture of doom and gloom. So where does this sense of anxiety, this sense of we are completely in the wrong direction, there's no hope, there's no tomorrow coming from? Again, like my thinking on this is still very much fluid, but I think it's not quite a crisis of confidence. It's more like what happens when there's this huge gap between your expectation and reality. If you are born into a middle-class Chinese household, there are certain things that you take to be true, right? Your parents worked really hard, they bought a house, they already paid down the mortgage, you have your family wealth stored in your house, which will appreciate quite a lot, and that's going to be a decent inheritance to you, right? And your parents invest really heavily in your education. Most of the college graduates now are from one-child households. So, you study really hard, your parents invest in your education, you go to a really good college, you kind of expect to be able to get a job in the tech sector, in the financial sector. Upon graduation, have a really lucrative career. That's sort of the expectation that has been building in people's mind for the past 10 plus years. But like now that equilibrium has been broken, right? First you have this years of tech crackdowns, right? All the high-flying tech companies and financial companies are cutting. They're not recruiting anymore. Those kind of lucrative jobs are just not there. And then you have 3 years of lockdowns, right? And then you have this property market thing where family wealth is now in jeopardy. So basically every single piece of that equation is kind of, it's no longer there. Like what you take to be 100% certain in the future is just not there. So I would say it's not really a crisis of confidence. It's that gap between reality, between what you currently see and dreams. So I think that helps explain one puzzling phenomena. If you go to those recruiting fairs in China, they're all empty, right? If youth unemployment is at 20%, you would imagine that people are eager to find jobs. They will take whatever is available out there. But why are people not showing up at those recruiting fairs? That's because those jobs that are offered are not the kind of jobs they want. So when we talk about Chinese youth unemployment at 20%, which is a historical level for China, I think, by some standard, people should be on the street, right? So people should be causing all kinds of social unrest. But that's not what we see in China. I think people are disillusioned, but it's not like they cannot find jobs and you have to starve on the street. That's not what's really going on. But back to Chang-Tai's point, I think what's really different this time is, when the central leadership, when Xi Jinping and Li Qiang announces these piecemeal measures to stimulate, to remedy the economy, the market just doesn't really take that, which is quite interesting. So, I mean, there are multiple hypotheses of what's actually going on, but one thing that I think is quite different from Zhu Rongji's time and now is Zhu Rongji is not one single person. Zhu Rongji has a team of capable economic lieutenants who can actually execute his plans, right? And many of them went on to be some of the Lou Jiwei, the Meng Qishan, the people like that. Many of those people have been purged by Xi Jinping during past years of anti-corruption campaigns. Especially Gong Daxi, Guo Kaihang, all of those Zhu Rongji lieutenants, they were hit really hard during the anti-corruption campaign. So there's this general sense that the people who can do this are just not there. And I would say the opposite. Like, there are so many people sitting on their hands, basically waiting for directions from the very top leadership, because they are afraid of the potential retributions. Like, what if I do this and something went wrong? I might as well just listen to whatever the top dictates to me. So that kind of inaction, that kind of inertia, I think is what's really problematic this time. And I don't have a really good solution to that, but this is what I see, and I just wanted to share that with our audience.
Underlying a lot of this is sort of a bigger question of China's overall economic direction, and what it is that Xi Jinping actually wants, the shape of the Chinese economy in his longer term view. And this is something that you've talked about a lot, and you actually identified back in 2017. I think you and Evan Feigenbaum wrote a paper that put your finger on this. I think proved very prescient. And we've seen these ideas echoed again out of the 20th Party Congress. This move away from GDP uberalis toward a more sort of qualitative growth, right? Can you talk a little bit about that idea? And I'd love Chang-Tai to weigh in as well about your thoughts on what it is that Xi and the current Chinese leadership want the Chinese economy to be and to do. We're no longer talking about KPIs for local officials measured in terms of GDP growth, but rather maybe in nanometers, as he once kind of half-jokingly said, but accurately said.
Right, so we published a piece basically with the title Nanometers Over GDP, and the idea is to crystallize this sense that, for 25 years, people were very much accustomed to, Chinese producing growth to meet a certain target, right? There was this term in markets called the Wenjiao output. So every time the economy would tank, they would do countercyclical stimulus because they wanted to achieve roughly 70% growth, because that fixation was really important. But starting in the 14th Five-Year Plan, it was very clear that the top leadership, in particular Xi Jinping, decided that was not going to be the case anymore. He said, we're not going to really have we'll have a range, we'll still sort of think about growth, but basically that target is now no longer valid. We shouldn't fixate our entire growth strategy around that. So that's important because the problem is that they didn't really clarify what the floor is going to be, right? So how far can this fall? Are we talking 2%, 3%? What are they satisfied with? And I think this is where I think sort of agree and also disagree with what Chang-Tai and Lizzi said. I think we can all agree that this is not a 2008 Lehman Brothers kind of housing crisis, problem. And this is not what Lizzi says, sort of a Japanese-style balance sheet recession, which is, I think Richard Kuo, branded that. I think the analogy with the late 90s holds. It is a sort of debt problem. And just last time it was debt on the balance sheet of state-owned enterprises. This time the debt is primarily on local governments, right?
You put that $5 trillion that's at risk.
Right, so we can get to that number, but the main thing is that if you think about it, the macro conditions, though, are quite different now than it was in the late 1990s. So let's recount what happened. China was about to enter the World Trade Organization, right at the end of the 1990s. That really gave it a big lift in growth.
Right.
And then China had, in 96, 97, just privatized the property sector.
Right.
That was a big growth driver, right? Now you have just the opposite. The property sector is declining, and they're not really trying to save it as much as we think. There's no WTO.
No function.
There's nothing coming that way. So I guess the question is, deleveraging might be the right call, but to do it in a low growth environment when it's not clear what the future growth drivers are going to be, is that too risky of a gamble to execute right now when the entire system is sort of saying we don't care that much about GDP growth anymore, right? So when you grow, even if you take on debt, you can actually inflate away that debt if you have inflation. So actually, that just becomes a smaller portion of GDP over time. That's essentially what happened since the 1990s.
But unpack this a little bit. Tell
So-
me what's the positive vision? What do they hope to achieve when they talk about qualitative growth? What does he really mean?
Well, I think, this is my own interpretation. My view is that China wants to become the Amazon of countries. Amazon is the everything store. China wants to be the make everything country. Essentially, they really think they can, if you think about 1990s, what was the main moniker attached to China? Factory of the world. 2023, what did China say to do? Also factory of the world. Just those factories have changed from socks and Nike shoes to batteries and low-end chips and all those technology products. And I think China really feels it's got a strong competitive, advantage in all these mid-range type supply chains manufacturing. And, obviously I'm exaggerating to say make everything, but I think the strategy is, can we attract a global supply chain ecosystem to China, make it there, and sort of export it around the world? That could, lend it the growth that it might need, that might need to offset some of the other growth drivers that are slowing down.
Lizzi, you had an interesting way of talking about it. You used the martial arts metaphor. You said it's the innate. I don't know how to translate that. Sort of like your internal, like cultivating internal.
Right. I think I agree with Damien's framing, but I would use a slightly different word. I think China is really focusing on resilience of the system. So it's not so. And here in the United States, we tend to focus on the final product. When we want to develop the EV industry, we focus on consumers, cars, right? And that's what we focus on. Focus on our subsidies and policymakers' energies on. In China, I think they take a much more holistic view on what EV means. They started from rare minerals, down to infrastructure, down to batteries, down to the cocktail of government subsidies, tech breaks, and consumer tax credits, to the final product itself. So that's a much more, I would say, vertical way of thinking about what a product actually means. And by the way, that ensures that the whole system has enough flexibility. So if you want to attack a single part of that system, we want to make sure that there's enough fluidity in the system itself for the system to heal itself. So, a single, act of sanction wouldn't break the entire system. I think that's what I mean by 内功. It's the qi, it's the circulation that matters. And, I think at least.
But is that also because the external environment is just not as conducive to
yes,
China's products?
Absolutely. And one thing that I noticed is that there's a lot of focus on how to adapt to hostile external environments as we speak of, as we can see from the case of Huawei, right? And I think they expect that to happen in the future. So they sort of preempt future sanctions and restrictions by making sure there's enough leeway in the system to have at least 3 or 5 years of buffer to sort of to sustain that attack, right? So Huawei did not survive by making trailblazing breakthroughs in 5G in chips. Huawei literally found a get-around. Huawei developed a software system to get around hardware restriction. Huawei developed those chiplets quite literally by stacking sort of inferior chips together to achieve roughly the same thing as those high-speed chips can do. I think that's what China has gotten really good at. For most of the business and industrial organizations, sort of top technology is actually not necessary. You just need to find something that works and execute that really well. And I think that's sort of what China is focusing on. Just sort of my observation.
Chang-Tai, how would you describe, say you talked about this period of readjustment that we're in right now. What's the end goal of that readjustment? What is the imagined end state post-readjustment?
Let me just say, I'm going to get to your question, but let me just say that I think there's something else. There's something else, and I asked this question, and I don't. But I'm going to ask the question to the other people on the panel because I don't have an answer. There also just seems to be something more than resilience, and I don't know what it is about this view that certain things that certain products or certain technologies are the ones that are valid and other things are invalid.
Yeah.
So let me just maybe the example is that there is that semiconductor chips are a real thing, and it's something that China needs to be, and it would be great if China were good at making semiconductor chips. But coming up with the software, the very best software in the world to design semiconductor chips, that's not a real thing. And I don't quite.
I'm not sure that they would classify that as not a real thing. The things that they think are not real things are, creating complex financial derivative-based products, doing social media. They don't want their best and brightest being steered into, like in the United States, they want their physicists to graduate from Tsinghua and freaking do physics. They don't want them to go work for, a social media company or go work for a bank to design, speculative products.
But the question is, fine. For some products, you can say that they're negative externalities, right? They're negative. But why is the chip company or the revenues from a chip company more valid than the revenue of Alibaba, say, right? But there's a very clear sense in which one company is really valuable and the other company is less so.
Because they want to be Germany.
But why?
Because they really honestly, and this is something, I get into this in this
Well,
documentary.
because software platform, social media has social political ramifications ultimately.
That's only part of it.
A chip does, that's one factor. A chip is a chip. It doesn't have that baggage.
No, but even something like food delivery, software for food delivery, that has no political ramification. But my sense that if you ask them, they'll say, who cares, right? If you come up with a better food delivery system.
And you was the one who introduced this phrase earlier in the conversation, grasp the heavy, let go the light. This is exactly what they believe they're doing right now. That's what they believe themselves. What was the phrase that China, Arthur Kroger, a great talk you should check out. He says, China wants to be a Leninist German.
I think that's exactly the right phrase. But let me just ask the question is, let me just pull two companies. NVIDIA is one, right? That is one. It's the leading chip company in the U.S. And for those of you who know NVIDIA makes nothing, right? It just designs chips. It's just incredibly good at chip design, and they also are really good at doing the software but it makes nothing, right? It makes nothing. So think about NVIDIA versus Taiwan Semiconductor, right? Which, Taiwan Semiconductor, what they know how to do really well is to actually make it, right? And I guess for my vantage point as an economist, I think both of these things are incredibly valuable. Are incredibly how valuable they are? Well, it's what people are willing to pay for these things. But the leaders of the party, I think they think about it differently, and I don't fully understand why. I don't fully understand why. Let me just say, so I think that there's one thing there, right? There's one thing, or say, software to tutor kids. Clearly, that's that's of no value, but why not, right? Kids learn, and
well, in this case, they believe clearly that this creates social problems by, inequity, just by inequality of opportunity, right? That's in this case. I don't think that they would look at, one part of the value chain and another part of the value chain in something like semiconductors and say this part isn't important and this part is. I think that when it comes to semiconductors, they do believe that the manufacturing process is absolutely vital and that they should focus on never stopping manufacturing because they really buy into this idea that process knowledge, that the actual innovative advantage conferred by continuing to manufacture is very good. I think
Another factor is just China has basically converged with the West on software, on a lot of on the app economy. China, frankly, makes some of the best apps in the world already, right? So the gaps where they feel they're still deficient in is in a lot of these, hardware segments.
We could go on with this for a while, but I want to get back into a really cheery topic, which is local debt. I mean, I think this is, so Damien Ma recently put out an estimate that there's about $5 trillion of local debt that's at risk in the next default in the next 3 years.
Potentially, yes.
Let's just put that in perspective. What was 2023, the projected GDP is $19.4 trillion. So we're talking about north of 20% of,
Right.
of
Well, but remember, the debt to
25%.
the debt to GDP ratio is way high, it's always high, right?
It's always high,
That,
right.
that is quite a bit.
But I want to ask Chang-Tai, what does an actual debt crisis look like in China? What are the ramifications? What are the spillovers? What sectors are I mean, if you are a money manager and you're looking at China, where do you steer away from? Where do you now, where do you think you want to limit your exposure in China where we start seeing massive default of local government debt?
Let me just first give a direct answer that is, clearly the property sector, but the property sector, there could be some part of the financial institutions, like, there's like, if I think about sort of where a lot of the action is taking place, it's really in the combination of these local financing vehicles and shadow banking. Some of these we have data, a lot of these we don't, right? So there's a bunch of it. But let me just push back on that I don't think that really is the biggest issue. I don't think that really is the biggest issue. I think the biggest issue is sort of what Lizzi was talking about, which is vaguely, it's about, yeah, I call it this, I mean, first it's this view that things have changed in China. And I want to hone in on one thing, right? On one thing. And I think, when I think back, so let me put it this way. I think that one way I think about China for a long time is that despite the fact that, there's, that there are no formal property rights, there was this very clear sense about what the rules of the game were, right? About what the rules of the game were. That is, if I'm an entrepreneur, I don't engage in politics. I don't engage in politics. I mean, fine if they want to, make me a member of the local national party's Congress, I will do it, of course. But if I don't engage in politics, I will be left alone. I will be left alone. Although there's nothing formal about it, my property rights are going to be protected. I can grow. I can make money. I can accumulate my wealth. I think of it almost like this marriage, right? There's like this. I think about what a good marriage is. It's about there are clear expectations on both sides about what proper behaviors. Nothing is written down, of course, right? It's written down. There's no prenup, right? There's no prenup. And after the fact, I think that what happened last year may have shattered that contract, right? Shattered that contract. Like things that I thought only happens to dissidents, things that only happen to somebody like Jack Ma. I'm not studying that, but I think I didn't think about it then, but it may be the sense of what happened in 2022 is that, hey, the party can actually be really crazy. The party can actually be really crazy. The party can actually do really crazy stuff. And this crazy stuff can happen to me. Can really have happened to me, even if I've done nothing. I've done nothing what I've done. So that may be part of it. I don't quite know how to quantify it. And I'm curious to know your views on like how much is going, but it's almost like I think of it as like the breakdown of a marriage, of a marriage that these are the things that I believed about you, and now I don't believe in it, and I don't believe it.
You and Lizzi are apparently on the same wavelength, because recently she was on our sister podcast, the China Global South podcast.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about the same sort of breakdown of the informal
The
social
contract.
contract, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. I wanna, we only have a few minutes left. I really wanna focus on one final big question. I'll start with Damien, which is, what should US policy do? Do we seem to be sort of all indulging in a kind of schadenfreude, looking at China's travails economically and almost gloating over it? But China is deeply connected, contagion. I mean, it could bring our house down as well. It could impact us negatively. What is wise American policy when it comes to China right now in terms of supporting or helping along its economic troubles? What should we be doing? Should we be rooting for China, or should we be rooting for the forces that beset China?
Well, look, U.S. and China are still 40% of the global economy. You look at what's going on at a macro level. Europe's not doing so hot. Germany, France not doing so hot. It could enter a recession. The United States, that debate's still outstanding. Whether in a few quarters we might still see some recessionary characteristics.
Please not before November.
And the Chinese, even if they stimulate, they're probably not going to get too much above 5% this year, which is fine but not great. So I think if we're thinking about global economic stability, there's no reason why the U.S. and China should think about how to provide the anchor as 40% of the global GDP which they did try to do that in 2008,
That's right.
2009. And I think this is a time that's gonna be needed more than ever. The geopolitical volatility aside.
Can you imagine China having a major financial crisis that threatens to bleed into the global economy, and the U.S. stepping up in the way that China did in 2008?
Well, I don't think the nature of the crisis is going to be that sort of global contagion like that, because it's not going to come from the formal financial sector. It's mostly going to be a domestic debt crisis. But a China that grows below its potential is not a good thing when the world needs growth. And I think investors are going to be looking for growth. And if all the big three pillars, the EU, the United States, and China, their trifecta, are all kind of anemic, that's not a good outcome for the global economy.
Absolutely. Lizzi, what are your thoughts on this? And then I'll leave the Chang-Tai for the end.
Right, so I'm gonna answer a slightly different question of what the United States, what doesn't work for the United States. Okay. I think by making China look bad, by making China do bad, that clearly does nothing to, for the United States to strengthen itself. And I see a lot of reflections in the media when it comes to China from policymakers. I do think the United States need to think harder about what its own strength is and what its own course is. I think ultimately the United States can only become stronger by becoming stronger. It won't become stronger by making China look like a bully, making China look weak. I mean, I don't want to go full therapist on this, but I think there's a lot of soul searching for the United States to do, and it has nothing to do with what China looks like in the future.
Run faster, goddammit, and stop trying to put the other
Oh, yeah.
I don't think that's completely right. So let me try to articulate what I think the U.S. is struggling with. That for a long time, I think that we have all believed, and it's true, of course, that everybody gains from trade and investment. If China grows, the U.S. gains. If the U.S. grows, China gains. I don't think there's any doubt about that. What the U.S. is struggling with is the question of, suppose that, or let me put it this way, I will give an analogy. Suppose that there's a powerful CEO, right? The owner of a company that or that you believe is a racist, okay? And if that person is poor and they're a racist, it doesn't matter because they have no money, right? They have no money. The question is, what if this person is worth $1 trillion? And this person it's not a problem if this person just wants to buy a fancy yacht with
But now we're talking about Elon Musk.
That's a question. Suppose that Elon Musk is going to do stuff that you fundamentally disagree with, and he can do it if he has money, right? The question is, what are you going to do, right? You're going to lose if you don't buy that Tesla, right? You're going to lose. You love that Tesla, and you love that Tesla, but you buy that Tesla, and that person starts to do stuff that you fundamentally disagree with, right? And I think that is the tension. I mean, that is what the U.S. is really struggling with. So it's really that, right? It's really and it's a spiral that's going on, which is this fear in the U.S. on what are you going to do with your economic power, right? And then on the other side, on the Chinese side, there's this widespread belief that the goal of the U.S. is to destroy China, right? And this speaks to the question about, China faces a hostile environment, so we got to build resilience. And so you can see how these two views of the world easily reinforce each other. And you could start off with a situation where China has no intention towards the rest of the world, that Elon Musk is really a nice guy, is really a nice guy. But then you start to do stuff towards him, and Elon Musk feels threatened. Then they start to do so. And I think that is the spiral that we are on, and that could get both sides to do things that they originally did not want to do. So what should U.S. policy be? I don't know, right? It's really. I think that's a spiral. That's a very dangerous spiral that we are on now.
Convergence on capabilities, divergence on values.
Yeah. All right, folks. Thank you so much for coming and for joining us for this. Damien Ma.